Good afternoon, everyone. From UK, it's 2 p.m. in Oxford, and it's a pleasure to be welcoming everyone in the room and online to this Centre for Global Higher Education webinar. My name is David Mills, and I'm delighted to be welcoming our speaker today, Tim Blackman, who has had a fascinating and rich career leading higher education institutions and pushing them to think again about what their missions are. Firstly, in Durham, and then Vice Chancellor of Middlesex, and then Pro-Vice Chancellor at OU, and then Open University Vice Chancellor until a couple of years ago. So you've got lots and lots of experience on which to draw upon, and you've written a couple of really interesting, peppy policy pieces over the last few years, thinking about how we need to really reform our higher education system in the UK. So I'm hoping that this sort of will provoke lots of conversation and thought. And it's great to have big blue sky thinking from people who actually have an awful lot of policy experience and not just sitting in policy think tanks planning ideas. So it's a warm welcome to you, Tim, at the screen, and the room's yours.
Thank you very much, David, and welcome everybody. Thanks for inviting me to come and talk, those in the room and to those of you online. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm going to share some slides. Hope this works. Yeah. So, just a brief bit of background. I'm going to talk on the second of the two pieces David mentioned that I've written for HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute. The first was an essay on the comprehensive university published back in 2017. And that was an argument for extending the comprehensive education model into higher education, a model that essentially is already used by the Open University. The second is what I've been invited to talk on today, which is this booklet on higher education and the sustainable economy, which argues for far-reaching change in how we provide higher education. And both are free to download on the HEPI website if you want to follow anything up. And I've given it a plug there, the second publication, and I've started off with somebody who wrote interesting critical assessment of it, saying all the things that I got wrong. And then I put a bit of praise there as well, which was nice to see on LinkedIn. But I think the idea was that this would be a policy provocation anyway. And as the second reviewer notes, my argument is actually quite simple. And there are 5 main points. The first is that we should, in the current situation we have in this country and the world, we should be focusing the higher education sector on producing knowledge and skills needed to build a sustainable economy. And that's because of the existential risks we essentially face from, in a nutshell, overconsumption and underinvestment, including climate change. Secondly, we need to end how the current higher education system in England bunches up costs and then charges interest for repaying those costs by the use of the full-time honours degree model, which dominates undergraduate provision, bunches up costs, leaving either graduates or the state with a lot of debt for a qualification that now ages rapidly. Third point or recommendation is to expand higher education participation, but not higher education as we currently know it. So to expand participation, so it's over a working lifetime, with shorter qualifications, enabling skills and knowledge to be updated or added to. Fourth recommendation is to pay for this by essentially standardising curricula and regulation, controversial thing to say in higher education, not subsidising residential higher education, and making more use of technology in course production and content, teaching and assessment. And the fifth recommendation, preview these, is about disinformation that we're not going to make progress with any of the wicked issues without, I think, higher education stepping into that space, into the public square, establishing academic knowledge as information and not disinformation or misinformation, not by claiming that academics know facts, but by this special status for academic knowledge being about academics and students abiding by an explicit code about how they learn. So I'm going to say more about all that in a moment. I wrote the second heavy piece during visiting fellowship here back in Michaelmas term last year at the Client for Continuing Education and Harris Manchester College. I just want to acknowledge how grateful I am for the stimulation, support and collegiality I received during that special experience. So there are three big influences on what I'm about to say. The first is having two grandchildren. The second is the work of the Oxford economist Dieter Helm, who's been very influential in my own thinking. And the third is having been actually quite involved in an advisory capacity in the development of the lifelong learner entitlement, the LLE, which is the new funding support regime for higher education in England that goes live from January 2027. So the grandchildren made me even more aware than I was of the extent of nature loss since I was their age. It's one thing to read about nature loss, it's another to go looking with your 7-year-old grandson for stag beetles and hedgehogs and not finding any when it was a common experience for me when I was his age to find a stag beetle or a hedgehog. And this nature loss is an aspect, of course, of a deeper crisis. And that brings me to the second influence, Dieter Helm. Dieter chaired the Natural Capital Committee, which advised the government at the time on the sustainable use of natural capital. Nature loss is defined by economists in terms of depletion or indeed degradation of a natural asset, of that natural capital in terms of the resources and services it provides. And this is all part of a bigger picture, an economy that, in his analysis, and I agree, is a situation of economy that is unsustainable. And at the heart of the sustainable economy challenge is an economy that fails to cost into prices, essentially, the cost of pollution, the cost of carbon reduction, and then on top of that, fails to price in the use of non-renewables, especially non-renewable natural assets that are often treated as free. Paying for those full costs, the services and resources they provide, and the impact of production in terms of pollution and carbon production, ultimately means less consumption. And that's by us, because we are buying the products of the industries that are part of the problem. We are also part of the problem if we buy this stuff. And this inevitably means less consumption. We need to pay more for less. We overconsume, which is a really difficult political challenge. I mean, the transition to renewables is going to be very costly, and it's very difficult for politicians to get that message over. We're in a sort of age of accelerations. Overconsumption means our economy is unsustainable in both the meanings of that term. These graphs just sort of summarise the situation. Financially, debt is mounting. That's the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility projection. The UK debt, all other things being equal, which they sort of can't be, but that's the projection. Demographic change is a big driver of that curve. Not sustainable environmentally. Global carbon dioxide concentration is going to keep rising, even if we do manage to start to reverse emissions. concentration that really matters. It's like turning a tanker. And that problem is associated with a whole host of associated issues of resource depletion in minerals, soil, water, and of course serious impacts that are inevitable now at some scale regarding floods, severe storms, climate refugees. And the related issue to all this is that we're consuming at the cost of not maintaining essential assets, let alone not enhancing, but not maintaining essential assets. Assets essential to meeting human needs, natural capital, but also health and education services, physical and IT infrastructures. So Helm's basic argument is we're over-consuming, we're borrowing to consume, we're not investing in these essential assets, one of which is natural capital, which we often treat as free. And to borrow to consume, this is of course what many universities now are doing, because of their financial situation, they're using reserves or borrowing to fund day-to-day spending, not investment in enhancements. You can't do that out of current income and expenditure. You should be investing in enhancements. And if we borrow to consume, which is essentially what our generation is doing, we're basically passing on the cost of our current consumption to our children and grandchildren, and paying for it. So Helm has set out these arguments in his book Legacy: How to Build the Sustainable Economy. It's free to download, and it's a real, I think, sort of agenda blueprint for change. The third influence was developing the LLE, the Lifetime Learning Entitlement, which I had a bit of involvement with as an advisor, but won't take any of the credit or, well, I'll take some criticism for it because I think it is the right way to go. It's the LLE is aimed at pivoting the higher education system in England away from what I see as the 20th century model of spending 3 to 4 years straight after school or college, taking an honours degree, and that's it. That's your experience of higher education. Often away from home, paying rent to a landlord, studying for a big qualification, often in an academic discipline with no student number controls, rather than in a professional or technical qualification, and then that's your actually done. And pivoting that, the other leading is aiming to pivot that away from that to a lifelong learning model, which is about shorter courses taken over a working lifetime. And in doing that, focusing on the skills and knowledge for making a living, essentially, including keeping those skills and that knowledge updated or doing retraining. And the issue for me is that the LLE, I feel, is the right framework, but it's likely to be underpowered in terms of policy levers, in terms of the extent of change it can achieve across HE and FE. And in fact, there's been a history of past attempts to move away from the dominance of the 3-4 year honours degree, which have kind of all failed. You can go back further than this, but I'll go back to the higher education diploma introduced by the 1973 Education Act, which was meant to become an important additional way of participating in higher education. It kind of withered on the vine. Other examples, foundation degrees, and I think probably higher technical qualifications, which has recently started to go the same way. And that is likely to happen because of weak policy incentives. Frankly, there need to be much stronger policy incentives because the full-time honours degree is good business for a university. And it has significant signalling power for employers, over and beyond its value as a practical qualification. So there's constantly been academic drift back to this dominant qualification, which, of course, is a qualification developed in an elite system that was rolled into, I think, with not a lot of thought, into a mass participation system, which explains, I think, a lot of the financial tensions we've got in the sector. And the latest example of this drift to the honours degree was the changes made in 2012-2013, the ending of student number controls in England, the trebling of fees, but with a student loan system that basically presented the student with very little upfront cost, but a big debt to pay back over their working lifetime. And that finally killed off higher national diplomas and higher national certificates in the English education system. These were level 4 or 5 higher education qualifications. They still exist, but they're a very small part of the picture, bigger in Scotland for reasons we might come to. But they were killed off because the loan system and the ending of student number controls meant that why would you do an HND, HNC if you could get a place to study for a degree in a system with no student number controls and the upfront cost was no higher to do a so-called higher qualification than an HND or HNC. And that's indeed what students did. And that was largely the end of HNCs and HNDs. And the result, I've argued, is that higher education is now itself part of the overconsumption problem. It's true that much of higher education is about investment rather than consumption. The asset in this case is our human capital. We're borrowing to enhance that asset, to make our human capital more valuable, not just to the economy, but also to society. And doing that is essential to achieving an economy with high productivity, with all the benefits that brings. But it needs to be about investment in a sustainable economy and not just a productive economy. But large parts of higher education, I argue, are not about investment, they're more consumption. And I include in that the residential model. It's unusual by international standards. It adds to student and government debt and has disrupted housing markets across the country. Secondly, I think there's been a fleshing out of both academic subjects and professional qualifications to fill 360 credits. That means you get degree recognition and degree status. Frankly, I think it is possible to be an engineer or a historian with less credits than that in your initial qualifications, especially if that leaves headroom for later updating to remain a competent historian or engineer. And a lot of what's learned in such voluminous qualifications as the honours degree dates rapidly and gets forgotten. And thirdly, I'd argue that a lot of higher education is about consumption, not investment, because the content that's about self-formation, as it's often called, so-called self-making, reflexive agency, is, in my view, overdone. This doesn't happen uniquely in higher education. And if it is uniquely something to do with higher education, self-formation, personal development, reflexive agency, then it's outrageous that less than half the population are given that opportunity through our selective higher education system, because that's the reality. In fact, I've yet to be convinced really that a university has some special claim to achieving self-formation. It's possible in other organisations, it's possible in the workplace, it's possible in the community. And there are plenty of often free resources to develop yourself as a person through the BBC, through YouTube, through the Open University, free resources. So I think the situation is rather different. The residential model is often claimed to be important to this self-formation agenda. It's good character-forming stuff to move away from home to study for a degree. Unusual, as I said, by international standards. What I argued in the comprehensive university piece is that actually I think it's probably more character-forming to go to your local comprehensive university and mix with other people from very different backgrounds than to move, sometimes hundreds of miles to a selective university to just mix with people like you, because of the way academic selection stratifies students into universities of higher and lower selectivity. So that's sort of setting up my stall. The urgent and most important task for higher education seems to me to build the sustainable economy. The overconsumption of the elements I've described adds to the debt problem, but also extends the carbon footprint of higher education. I think higher education needs to be, as a sector, the institutions in it need to be accountable for their carbon footprint, not as they now to some extent are, just in terms of their estates and their energy consumption, but in terms of their curriculum and their research. These all have a carbon footprint in terms of what graduates go on to do, in terms of how those courses are taught and where they're taught. So I suggested in the heavy piece that subjects be banded according to their contribution to the sustainable economy. Some are more important to green transition than others. And in terms of financial subsidy, that should drive the support. Each institution, for example, could have a carbon budget in terms of its curriculum. So at university with a deep green curriculum could have some carbon credits it can actually sell to a university that wants to still maintain a more high carbon curriculum, but they want that subject range. So carbon trading in curricula is something I suggest. My case that we overconsume higher education, though, is certainly not to side in the sort of culture wars with those who say there's too many university students. We actually don't need to consume less higher education, but as I've sort of previewed, we need to consume more of it differently. And in a way that's about less indebtedness, more pay as you go, and about less damage to the climate and the environment. Certainly, I think it's crazy that anyone's first engagement with higher education does not leave them occupationally qualified. It's making your way, making a living in life, with a foundation that they can build on with further updating or specialisation. And I don't think that needs to mean the end of the liberal arts and critical social sciences, but we should recognise that that type of education is now actually freely available from other places, and actually is already often part of occupational qualifying qualifications, because those attributes are important in all sorts of transferable ways. And there's surely enough jobs for everyone in the sustainable economy that we need to fill, ranging from battery technologies, smart energy systems, green finance, sustainable management, environmental planning, horticulture, ecology, low carbon logistics, resource recovery. There's a huge industrial policy agenda there, which is about essentially reindustrialisation of this country. And given the tech content of these jobs, and including the rise of AI, surely all those jobs need higher learning to be their most productive. And indeed, any competency that doesn't need higher learning should probably be automated anyway. It's sometimes said that the trades, like plumbing and electrical work, care work, are more immune to automation than some of the professions like accountancy, legal services, etc. But those jobs, so-called trade jobs, are professional jobs in my view. If they're not, they should be. There's a lot of technology involved. I don't know how many of you have installed a central heating system, but to do that, it's a so-called level 2, level 3 skill. Actually, quite difficult. So why is that regarded as somehow lower level learning than picking at random, understanding land conflicts in a geography degree, which is level 6? Something not quite right there. That's getting more not right as technology becomes part of these so-called trade and caring occupations. And this requirement to qualify occupationally in green skills needn't be sort of completely dominant. It could be a major-minor system, where you major as a heating engineer, but if you're fascinated by classics, you do a module or two in classics, and the system allows you to do that, which the LLE has potential to do. So moving towards the end of this, I say consume higher education differently, and I also argue consume it as a universal, not just a mass system, but universal. And the reason I argue for that is not just economic needs. As the economy becomes more complex, the learning to be part of that economy becomes more complex, but because of the situation we have with misinformation and disinformation, which and dealing with that is a precondition for dealing with some of these global challenges we face. And higher education is potentially very important to tackling this. Academic knowledge should have a special status as information and not disinformation and misinformation. Trust in knowledge is eroding across the world. Academics are less trusted than they used to be, and particularly among more sort of populist and leaning and disengaged groups who tend to be non-graduates, of course, trust in experts is very low. So studying at university should be about learning information and not disinformation, misinformation, but in particular, learning how to tell the difference, how respect for evidence is crucial, how openness to criticism is crucial, how clarity is crucial. If a student claims to know something, they need to be able to explain how they know it, not just that they know it because they've got a degree. And certain principles need to be accepted for that to happen. Clarity, respect for evidence, openness to criticism. Yet there's no requirement for academic practice to abide by those principles. Instead, we have the crazy agenda in England of the regulator saying there must be freedom of speech. Well, in academia, no, there needs to be a commitment and an explicit signing up to a code that says this knowledge has a special status because of how it's being produced. It's being produced through openness to criticism, through respect for evidence, through clarity of the argument. And yet we have no professional practice code, like many of the professions do, like nurses and doctors, etc. We now have no professional code that says, as an academic, this is the reason why I know. And these are the principles that have governed and for which I will be held to account for, that mean I've got something special to say as a graduate of the system or as an academic. We don't do that. How do we claim to know things? And if universities can't do that, say, well, the reason we can claim a special status for our knowledge, then what are they for? My agenda is for a major expansion of higher education for societal and economic reasons, but through shorter courses, lifelong participation, priority for subjects that build with sustainable economy, because we are in a very, very serious situation, and a regulatory code that sets out principles by which we claim that our academic knowledge is special. Finally, how can it all be paid for? Taxes are already fairly high, fairly progressive in this country. There's probably a bit of room to increase a few percentage points to the higher bands to corporation tax. But actually, there are other things that need to be done. Standardising the curriculum and ending this sort of cottage industry of each institution writing their own version of a subject. It's controversial, but it would save a lot of money. And it would also transform a student's ability to transfer credit from one institution to another and top up from one qualification to another qualification. The big impediment to that is that all the institutions design their courses differently, even if they're history or computer science, they're different. Big productivity gains can be achieved through technology and teaching and assessment, and we can spread the cost of participating in higher education with shorter qualifications that are more pay-as-you-go rather than just accumulate a lot of debt because of the bunching at the beginning of your higher education career. And we can further reduce costs by increasing participation in learning through commuting and online rather than the residential model being so prevalent. So, to finish, my concluding points are what I've just run through: standardise the curriculum, achieve productivity gains using technology, spread the cost of participation, reduce the cost of increasing participation through studying differently, and all of this, it's not meant to be some sort of technocratic nightmare scenario that I'm promoting. It's because we are in a really serious situation with rising debt and rising sea levels, rising environmental challenges, that we've got to orientate the system surely to tackling those actually existential threats. And we've got to do that in a way that does not add further to debt and does not add further to environmental damage. And with so many other competing pressures on public spending, we need to navigate a way through that does recognise the difference between investment and consumption in our higher education system, and puts the money into investment. And what greater investment can there be than building a sustainable economy? Because an economy that is not sustainable will not be sustained. That's it.
Great, thank you very much. That's brilliant. You've given us lots and lots to argue with there. And we won't people online will want to post comments in the chat. If you want to unshare them, you can see online. So for those of you online, please just do post questions, and I can ask you to ask them directly. I'm going to start, and then I'll open up to the room as well. Tim, you hinted at the challenges.
Yes.
I can see that you've got a whole long line of people who are going to say no. The academics are not going to like the idea that their autonomy to design their courses is removed. The universities are going to lose their market ability, their ability to sort of claim their own autonomy as well. Where do you think the allies are?
The challenge I'm facing at the moment is trying to get my slides to stop sharing.
Don't worry, it's fine.
But I'll get there eventually. Allies. Well, we were talking about this over lunch, actually. A very important ally is the further education sector, which has been the Cinderella in our education system, because of a loss of prejudice and because of a loss of underinvestment. And one of the aims of the LLE is to try to introduce more permeability between further and higher education towards what is I think, a global trend towards tertiary systems. I think the policy architects of the lifelong learning entitlement certainly are fully on board in terms of a closer relationship between how public subsidy is used to support participation in higher education and industrial strategy. I think industrial strategy doesn't reflect the degree of risk we face from needing to build a more sustainable industry. So there's a mix of policy support, some industry support, some sector support in terms of certainly the tertiary sector. But I think there's not enough of a coming together that recognises quite how serious and how much big change is needed. And that's very quickly to do with, I think, not looking back and learning from what hasn't worked in the past.
Yes. Brilliant, thank you. Okay, I'll start in the room. I think you first, and then I think again.
Thank you very much. I agree that we face an existential crisis with the nature of the global crisis and also other existential crises such as wars and things like that. What I'm less convinced of is your argument that seems to be saying the humanities and social sciences aren't as important as they have been in the past. As a graduate of Bachelor of Arts, I'm not so sure.
That's the former deal with social science.
Absolutely.
But also as someone who started with a degree at the age of 29, like a lot of women do, that their first step into higher education is through the Bachelor of Arts. I mean, isn't it the case that it's the humanities and social sciences where society thinks about itself and what it should be like, where we think the unthinkable and think of alternatives? If we just focus on the instrumental disciplines and have a bit of social sciences on the side, I mean, two things could happen. First of all, our capacity to think that things could be otherwise is diminished. But secondly, who's going to get access to those disciplines? It seems to me that the social elites will monopolise those fields as they have done in the past. So I just think I agree with a lot of what you say. I'm just not sure about your positioning of the humanities and social sciences in all of that.
Yes, I think that's an important challenge. I think things have changed. There's an awful lot of humanities and social sciences out there. BBC does amazing work. And to say that opportunity to engage in humanities and social sciences is only confined to people that academics choose to select for courses, and in this country they still select less than half of young people and less than half of the population as a whole as that experience. There's a huge equity issue there. So to challenge that equity issue and say, well, everybody can participate in higher education doing any subject they like is incredibly costly. So there has to be some prioritisation of where higher education sits vis-a-vis schools, health services, infrastructure, etc., and where humanities and social sciences sit vis-a-vis people being educated in terms of a means of making a living, and in terms of the economic priorities for their economy. So I am saying there are some difficult priority choices to make here. There are other ways of engaging with a liberal education. And anyway, we don't allow most people to engage with that liberal education anyway. So those mix of arguments to me end up pointing in the direction that I'm advocating. And finally, I think your argument does underestimate quite how far those conversations go in a factory or a pub or a bus queue, overdo quite how important the university education may be to thinking citizenship. And your idea that social elites may dominate if we're not educating all these people in higher education. Well, many people who have not had the privilege of higher education argue that it's the graduates who are that social elite anyway.
So go back or
I think the idea that we're going to have systematic production of disciplinary knowledge for the instrumental fields and not for the humanities and social sciences, I think is deeply problematic. And I think I'm an ex-FE teacher, and I think you will also underestimate the extent to which those disciplines are important in FE, and where we should be incorporating more of that, not less. I don't think you can say that half the population is a social elite. I think you can say that people who graduate from Oxford and Cambridge and perhaps Durham are the social elite, but not necessarily the entire population of graduates. And I'm not sure what the case is here, but in Australia, the Bachelor of Arts is the principal route to access higher education for people from disadvantaged backgrounds, particularly women. And so it is an equity route, and it does give them the potential to think about things. And I remember as an FE teacher introducing feminism and stuff like that, and my students were just amazed. It was, like their whole world was just turned upside down. And so it's those sorts of opportunities that I think we do.
Good, great. We've got Gavin and then Dias, and then Nick, so Gavin, you first.
Nathan.
Oh, sorry, you were first, please carry on.
Okay, thank you very much. Tim, I know where you want to get to. I want to get there too. I've been a long-term advocate of a degree for life, or a degree as a way of life. Where I struggle, and perhaps we struggle together, is exactly how we get there. What we need is a COVID-like disruption. Though hopefully not something that's in the way that COVID was, but in the way that maybe we're transforming from an oil economy to an electrical economy. It needs something that really changes the paradigm, because we have such huge inertia in the system. We've identified them, so we've got through industry, recognizing what it is that people will have that they contribute. And academia itself, we are, as a group of people, are actually enormously conservative sometimes. Although there are those amongst us who want to revolutionize, and you're clearly one of those. So what do you think, where's the disruption going to come from? How can we grow this in a little bit faster than just?
Oh, it's MOOCs, it's micro-credential, it's right, point precise. Precisely my.
Yeah. It might come from when central London and Hull start flooding.
Zoom today.
And it might come from the LLE if, as some policy designers of the LLE think, it's a slow burner that's gradually going to shift the system. Again, we were talking at lunch, I've been quite surprised at how some of the policy people in the DfE are very, very sensitive to public and media and House of Lords pushback, and just think, well, let's not pick that fight because we've got other fights going on, and we can just sort of gradually, incrementally shift the higher education system. So I think that's part of the picture. So I think change is inevitable. There's been a huge amount of change already. Just introduction of higher technical qualifications, the LLE itself, the introduction of T levels and V levels into level 3. So I think when we look back, we may well think, well, actually, quite a lot of change was happening. It's just that we didn't, as a baseline syndrome, we didn't quite notice it. So my optimism, to the extent there is optimism, is that we will probably see slow change inevitably as this country faces the consequences of such sluggish productivity, such growing amounts of debt, and such scale of environmental damage. There's various wake-up calls. Flooding's one. Probably people crossing the Channel in boats is just a trickle compared to what could be happening in a few decades' time. I think it will come slowly through those various channels, probably inevitably, but it would be better to face up to it and make the change quicker and in a more joined up way than probably will happen. That's the best I can do at the moment. Where do you think it might come from?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I fear that maybe if we could start again, it would be good. There is a presumption that all those that are in the system now are going to be in the system tomorrow, next week, and so on. Jobs for life, that sort of mentality.
Yes.
If that could be blown up, if we could all be forced to start again at the age of 40, that'd be interesting.
Well, yeah. Force people, moralising the fact that you do participate in higher education in a lifetime, and that it's rather odd to do that full-time degree. I think trying to get away from the full-time honours degree straight up to school, college being normal is necessary. But again, I think that's a slow change we will start to see. As well as I'm sort of gradually processing your challenge too, in the sense that I think one of the interesting things about V levels in our level 3 curriculum is you can do them alongside. You can do a V level in heating engineering potentially alongside an E level in history. And I think higher education should also enable that mixing. I think there's a problem of segregating people, especially with such voluminous qualifications between the humanities and the social sciences and the sciences, etc. more interchange. And in the comprehensive university pamphlet, I very much argued that this would be achievable. To some extent, the dual sector institutions in Australia do this. You know, that your heating engineer is rubbing shoulders with your classic scholar.
To some extent.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
the potential.
RMIT does it.
I always wish I'd done anthropology and plumbing, not just anthropology, but yeah, no. Well, I can see the argument for it. There is a lot of plumbing universities in Hong Kong, I'm saying that their selling point is the liberal and professional degree, where you have to do both liberal arts and the professional sort of course component. So it's exactly that model.
Yes.
And that's obviously trying to appeal to Hong Kong parents who want their children both to be employable, but also the children who want to be able to think critically about
Confucius.
well, maybe all the other things as well as Confucius, but yes, yeah. Yeah, I think your question, yeah.
I think half your answer to your question, David, is neoliberals, economic rationalists. I wouldn't ask what is the academics' warrant to speak. I wouldn't ask how do academics establish the credibility. I would ask it of the geographers, of sociologists, of political scientists. That is to say, your development and validation of knowledge is based on a discipline. It's based on a technique for understanding and developing knowledge. It's specific to a discipline. So we don't have academic critical thinking. We have critical thinking in each discipline. And minimally, your preparation of experts has to be deep enough to develop that expertise in the discipline to be able to make those judgments. It's not something you can do in problem solving, critical thinking.
Yeah, so foundational knowledge arguments.
It's not only knowledge, it is knowing the method of developing knowledge and evaluating knowledge specific to each discipline.
The criteria for evaluating knowledge.
Yeah.
Yes. But, I'm not particularly a fan of disciplines. They're artificial constructs. And increasing administrative constructs. But I don't really understand why fundamental principles like openness to criticism, respect for evidence, clarity, precision, why those are not cross-disciplinary and therefore can underpin the claims for academic knowledge to have a special status in our age of misinformation as a whole. I think it would be a backward step. So yes, we'll do that, but the historian comes to their knowledge through a different route to an engineer. I know many people will think that, but actually, I think when you look at the root of how their knowledge develops, there are common criteria that distinguish academic knowledge from gossip, faith, ideology, prejudice, and I think that distinction is really important for academia as a whole. Of course, if you begin to get more fine-grained, you're going to see certain disciplinary and occupational and professional criteria being important at the curriculum level. But as an institution, it seems to me universities and higher education institutions generally should have a special claim to manage their produce and therefore should be able to develop common criteria. But
the historical method is different from the method in physics. It's different from the method in mathematics.
At that disciplinary level,
And that's the level at which you judge knowledge claims.
yes. Well, it's a really interesting discussion, and I may well lose it, but I'm just wondering, is a historian not respectful evidence? Is an engineer not open to criticism? Do both of them not believe that clarity and precision in how they make their arguments are important?
But evidence in history is different from evidence in
Engineering.
I think, okay, well, yes.
You're both working with this in the same thing, which is how one makes sense of the communities of knowing, and there may be a word like evidence, but it's understood very, very differently, and that really matters.
Yes.
It really matters for how one proceeds. There were a couple of questions online, and I'll come back to the question in the room. That's okay. So Edith, who's in the library, asks a question about community in a different sense. She says, my thought is that if you had short courses or only remote participation, wouldn't you lose the huge part of what makes the university experience beneficial, which is community, networking, casual conversation, and therefore higher education becoming more of an atomized world and experience? How does one, exactly this conversation we've been having, isn't it? What's the value of the dialogical community itself?
Yes. I mean, certainly, I want to argue for everybody to do open university courses, and the OU struggles with the community aspect of the students' experience. But it is a suitable method of participation for many people, and can produce comparable outcomes. I think community personal development happen in so many different contexts. It doesn't only happen on a university campus. And yes, it's nice, that sense of community. If you are studying on a campus, it's a nice to have, and it's part of the experience. But is it one that should be publicly subsidised? Why isn't it available in the same way to an FE student or to a student who's not in a further or higher education? I just regard it more as a consumption aspect rather than an investment aspect of the higher education experience, because you can get that sense of collegiality, you can get those opportunities for personal development in many contexts. I mean, autobiographically, one of the most stimulating and collegiate periods I had of my research career was 5 years working in local government, heading up a research centre in Newcastle City Council in the 1990s. It was really stimulating. We were turning around so much research all the time. We were able to experiment with methods, different colours of paper, questionnaires in those days. I found a metropolitan local authority as a very intellectually stimulating environment. In fact, I wrote probably what I think is still my best book, called Urban Policy and Practice, based entirely on that experience. I just question the emphasis. Okay, it happens, it's a good thing, but it happens in lots of different ways.
Great. Okay. Well, a couple of questions in the room, but first from Mike. Mike, I've unmuted you. Do you want to ask your question about levers or anything else to ask?
Yeah, so I think Tim's right that policy levers are necessary, and I think we could see that when foundation degrees happened, there were strong levers you could only get additional student numbers if you did foundation degrees. You had to do it in partnerships, so there was a clear lever that made you do that. But what possible levers, apart from flooding some cities, is the government going to have to get people to participate fully in the LLE? How's that going to work?
Yeah, I suppose that's a great question. I mean, the levers that are available are, of course, there's still some grant funding in the system for priority subjects, for participation initiatives. It's much lower and much lower than exists in Scotland, for example. But that funding is still there and can incentivise the system. You could see initiatives around the availability of student loans, perhaps around the conditions attached to student loans. I mean, it's interesting that a lot of the hubbub that's going on about Plan 2 loans at the moment is about the progressive nature of the interest payments, that the more you earn as a graduate, the higher the interest you pay. And it's a redistributive element of the system. And you can see that working across subjects, as some countries do in terms of their entitlement. So the student loan system can work to prioritise. The grant funding system can, and to some extent the regulatory system can. This could be just required of institutions to receive any public funding, including for research. So there are some powerful tools that could be used. And I think we're seeing some of that roll out. For example, higher technical qualifications offered by a university or a college do attract a higher level of teaching support funding than degree courses. I think I'm right in saying there's certainly an incentive built in to the grant element for HTQs. So, you know, with not much controversy, probably because the level of funding difference is so small as not to upset many people, because the overall level of grant is not big enough to be a policy instrument in that way. But it's there in the system. You can see it there in the system. And some initiatives about writing off student loans, you know, are there in the system for certain employers, certain subjects. So there are tools available, and I would predict that we will see more power given to those tools slowly over time.
Good. Does that answer your question, Mike?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Another question there.
Yeah, so I work in higher education, but developing tools to sort of enable access and sort of sustainable education models into the future, predominantly built on AI and machine learning and the sort of technology native systems. And I think something that I've noticed in your in the HEPI report is about inclusion and accessibility, sort of breaking beyond the sort of quite rigid structures as defined by higher education. And I just wonder, what does, in your vision, any AI or technology native education model look like that sort of is flexible and that is like executive education? Because as you said, one of the best values you have is working in a local council doing incredible research. Do we need the higher education structures as they exist to teach people the skills and the academic and intellectual curiosity that the higher education brings, or can we use other tools to do that?
That's a huge question, huge question. And I think, you know, you're rolling up a lot of things in that, you know, the arrival of AI, technology. I think, I mean, AI is absolutely a game changer. And I think, you know, part of what a graduate of higher education from any qualification needs to understand is that as well as human colleagues, they're going to be working alongside digital colleagues, essentially. And the job descriptions are going to become lists of complementary skills that your technology will do and that you will do as a human. You know, one thing that sort of went on at the Open University, I'm not sure how much progress they made, was that the Chief Information Officer and the Chief People Officer should talk to each other more. You know, that HR agenda and the IT agenda. I mean, it seems to me those should be in the same role in many ways, because how we do things in our society are increasingly being about the convergence of technologies and the convergence of human and technological capabilities. So it's a massive game changer. But I think it's higher education not necessarily in a special position to be able to do that. And in fact, we may well see companies and perhaps public services, I think, develop faster. I mean, I was, you know, I'm trying to set up a social enterprise at the moment. Again, the same today at lunchtime, that ChatGPT is my business partner. You know, I just ask them a question and they say, "What do you think about this? Or can you go off and do this?" Previously, I probably would have been buying a idiot's guide to setting up a small business and working my way through it, or going off and doing a OU course on entrepreneurialism. Yeah, but instead, I've been learning sort of real time with this digital colleague. You know, you've got to be a critical user, of course. So this is a massive game changer, and I think we will see the arrival of these technologies blur the distinctions between academia and other institutions, companies, public services, and blur the way we distinguish between human and technological competences. So that, I mean, that's all I can say really, without spending the rest of the day talking to people about it.
Yeah.
But it's massive, and I think it probably adds strength to my argument in terms of what's going on.
Thank you so much.
It's 3:00, so we probably ought to wrap up here at end. And so thank you for those that posted comments online. I'll make sure that someone gets those afterwards. We'll post this tomorrow as well on our website so people can listen again. So you've been provoking to us, and we've only been around for 1,000 years, it doesn't mean been around forever. And you have given us lots to think with and challenged us. Lots of sacred cows have been slaughtered, which is always a good thing.
So convincingly.
So thank you for coming, and best of luck. And as you say, let's all keep an eye out for how LLEs might begin to change these debates. Thanks for coming, and we're here again next week, as usual, for our sense of education webinar. Please join us then. Okay, bye bye.